What's up guys, Asian here again with another theory crafting video, and today we're going to be discussing the difference between using 3 spell damage jewelry glyphs versus 2 spell damage glyphs with a Magicka regen glyph. So that's kind of what we're going to be exploring. We're going to be looking at the DPS difference and primarily the sustain difference that you'll see if you do decide to replace one of your spell damage glyphs with a Magicka regen glyph. So what we're talking about here is specifically for jewelry. Jewelry, you can have spell damage glyphs. So a lot of builds recommend having 3 spell damage glyphs. Some builds recommend 3, or you can go with 2 spell damage glyphs with a Magicka regen glyph. That's something that I personally recommend on my build. It's either you go all out with 3 spell damage, or you do 2 spell damage and a regen glyph, and whichever one you use will kind of fit your situation differently depending on your group and things like that. So the difference is really is the spell damage versus Magicka regen. Both are affected by passive boosts as well as buffs. So Magicka regen generally has more buffs compared to spell damage. Spell damage you only really have things like major sorcery and minor sorcery and maybe a couple of other small things that I'm forgetting. But you really only have access to those 2 buffs when it comes to spell damage. Magicka regen, on the other hand, is affected by the CP, your passives, any sort of class passives you have, any sort of racial passives you have, things like that. So there are more ways to get Magicka regen than buffs than there is to get spell damage buffs. So generally speaking, you'll get more than the base 169 Magicka regen. Typically speaking, it's going to be closer to around anywhere from like 240-ish, 250, 260. That's kind of more realistic of what you would actually see with the Magicka regen glyph. Compare that to the spell damage where it adds 174, but if you take into consideration you only really have major sorcery and major minor sorcery, that usually ends up being closer to around 203 to 210-ish, if I'm doing my math correct. So that's kind of what you are looking at when it comes to spell damage versus regen. The big thing though is sustain. If you drop your regen, you're losing about 240, 250 additional regen, and while that might not seem like a lot in longer fights such as Bet Asylum against St. Ohms, for instance, that extra regen does start to add up, because if you think about it, 250 regen every 2 seconds, if you multiply that by 30, you're missing out on, if I'm doing my math correctly, 7,500 extra magicka every minute that the fight's going on that you're not getting if you're getting 3 spell damage boosts glyphs instead. So you kind of want to balance it out. I never recommend stacking too heavily into one stat, and so part of this is also going to really depend on your needs. If you feel like your rotation, depending on how many heavy attacks you put in, you don't need that extra regen glyph, then by all means stick with 3 spell damage glyphs. But if you are feeling the sustain push, well, if you're starting to run out of magicka during fights constantly during raids, and you're running 3 spell damage, it might be worth looking into swapping one of those out with the regen glyph in order to kind of make up that difference there in terms of sustain. Because remember, in PvE, it's not necessarily all about the burst damage, it's about how well you can sustain your DPS throughout an entire fight. So we're going to be doing 2 parses, one with 3 spell damage and one with 2 spell damage and 1 regen glyph. So the 2 things that you're going to want to take a look at besides the DPS are going to be the sustain and where my DPS is at various points during the parse. So the big thing that you're going to want to look for is relative magicka. So what percentage of magicka do I have when I use my shooting star ultimate, when I drink my second potion, when I enter execute, things like that. And I'll try to point those out too as I'm doing my parse as well. And you can see how adding that 1 additional regen glyph really helps out our sustain. Do keep in mind that we are doing a 3 million dummy parse. We're not doing a 52 million dummy parse or a 25 million dummy parse, just for the sake of time. But 3 million dummy parses are obviously a lot shorter than your average raid parse, your in-raid boss fights. So any sort of sustain problems that we see with 3 spell damage glyphs or even 2 spell damage glyphs with the regen glyph, that's only going to be more pronounced in an actual raid. So you want to keep that in mind when we're taking a look at our numbers and we're taking a look at our sustain problems as well. So that's something that you're going to want to keep in mind. So for these 2 parses, we're going to start things off with 3 spell damage glyphs. We're going to keep everything pretty much the same in terms of gear and rotation. I'm not going to be changing up the rotation too much. If I do need to heavy attack additionally, that'll be because I don't have any more Magicka to sustain my rotation. That's the only time I'm going to break out of my rotation, but other than that, I'm pretty much going to try to maintain the exact same rotation between these two parses. Another thing to keep in mind too is part of this is dependent on how many crystal frag procs I get. Since that is a proc, I can't guarantee that we'll have the same number of procs between parses, so that's something you want to keep in mind when we're taking a look at sustain. So we were sitting at 26 on our second heavy attack, and we were at 50 with our first. Again, we're about 50 with our first shooting star. We're entering execute with about 40%. We got 34,887 if you guys are watching on the bottom corner there. I'm going to put that into our spreadsheet here. And now we're going to replace one of our spell damage glyphs with a regen glyph. Get our ultimate back up, and then we're just going to do the exact same rotation again. So for those of you guys who are wondering why we're using regen glyph and not a cost reduction glyph instead, I kind of already went over that in a previous video comparing regen versus cost reduction. The primary reason that we're using regen and not cost reduction is mainly because regen is affected by all these different buffs that I mentioned in the beginning of the video. Major intellect, minor intellect, class passive, race passives, things like that, CP points. So it actually ends up being much larger than your base 169. And the other thing too is that cost reduction is only really active while you're casting. If you need to break out of your rotation and stop casting to res somebody or play a mechanic, that cost reduction glyph actually isn't doing you any good. Compare that to the regen glyph, which is always pretty much going to be active. We're sitting at about 55% Magicka on our first heavy attack. So a little bit more, but not by much. Second heavy attack, we're at about 45. So now you're starting to see a difference because the fight's going on for longer. Not getting as many crystal frag procs, so that's another thing you want to keep in mind too. We're at about 60% Magicka when you use Shooting Star. And we're entering execute with about 55% Magicka. The question now is, what is our DPS difference going to look like? Suppose 33,878, so about 1k lower, but we ended with much more Magicka than we did previously. So I'm just going to add that to our spreadsheet, and then we're going to take a look at our combat metrics parse. Alright, so if we take a look at our combat metrics parse here, we're looking primarily at regen versus drain per second. So on our regen glyph here, we can see the difference is about 300 Magicka. So we're losing 300 Magicka per second on average. If we take a look at the spell damage glyph here, this is 3 spell damage, it's 1250, 1260-ish versus 1640. So we're losing almost 400 regen Magicka per second here on average, compared to the 300 here. So it's about 100 Magicka difference, maintaining our same rotation here, and that's per second. So in a minute-long fight, that it works out to be an extra 6,000 Magicka drain. So the question now, of course, is that 1k additional DPS that you're gaining, is that really worth losing out on that 100 Magicka regen per second on average? So let's take a look at our spreadsheet. So we have 12 parses, 6 on each side, 2 spell damage on the left, 3 spell damage on the right. As you can see, the difference here is 700 or so DPS, which equates to about a 2% difference. So it is noticeable. But as we saw in the parses, with the regen glyph, we didn't really have that big of an issue in terms of sustaining, especially considering that it was a 3 million dummy parse. With the 3 spell damage glyphs, when I was doing these parses, I was kind of actually felt pressure to finish the execute phase before I ran out of Magicka. During not witch mothers, the two spell damage parses, I didn't really feel that same amount of pressure. I felt like I could finish my execute phase without having to, push and hopefully not have to heavy attack. There were some parses on these 3 spell damage parses where I thought I would have to heavy attack in the middle of execute phase. I didn't have to for all of them, thankfully, but I definitely felt that pressure to do so, and I didn't feel that during the 2 spell damage glyph parses. So that's something you want to keep in mind. It's not just looking at the overall DPS. Yes, 3 spell damage is obviously going to pull higher than 2 spell damage in the regen. It's a matter of how can you sustain that DPS? Can you sustain that DPS in a longer fight? Remember, this is just a 3 million dummy parse, and I already felt the pressure during execute to finish it quickly so I don't have to end up heavy attacking during my execute phase. Now imagine doing that for a much longer duration, for a 5-minute, 6-minute long fight. You're going to have to heavy attack a lot more when you're using 3 spell damage versus 2 spell damage glyphs. So that's something that you want to consider, but ultimately it's going to kind of depend on your group, whether you have good orb management, getting resources back from orbs or shards, as well as, whether you have to break out your rotation or not to res somebody, because when you're not casting, obviously you're just regen Magicka, which boosts your regen per second versus drain per second ratio. So that's something you want to keep in mind. My recommendation would be, if you don't feel like you have any sustained problems with 3 spell damage glyphs in a raid, just don't change anything, just keep using your 3 spell damage. But if you are seeing yourself heavy attacking a lot more, if you feel like you are having sustained issues in raid with 3 spell damage glyphs, then do consider swapping one of those spell damage glyphs out for a regen glyph. It'll definitely help you out during the longer fights, and especially on a mag sorc that has a noticeably worse regen compared to something like a Magicka Nightblade or even a Magicka Templar. It's going to be very noticeable. It probably won't be as noticeable on a Nightblade or a Templar, just because, again, they have better sustain. But on a sorc, it is definitely something that you might want to consider, depending on your group and depending on how you feel during in raids. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.